Welcome to Philosophy Insights. In this clip, Ryan McMaken debates Jonathan Casey at LibertyCon, February 2024. The topic is, should there be a national divorce where some countries secede from the U.S. federal government? Here's McMaken.
So first of all, we just need to keep in mind the fact that self-determination is an individual right. It is a right that is recognized and has been recognized since the days of the Declaration of Independence. And if you look at the research and at the literature on the topic, basically the Declaration of Independence is recognized as the origin document of the right of self-determination and as a secession movement. And this is hardly some sort of unique theory of mine. We could consult David Armitage, the Harvard historian, on this, not exactly a Rothbardian, who notes simply that, it's obvious that the American Revolution was a secession movement and that the Declaration of Independence and the philosophy involved there is a matter of secession and self-determination. And we see this issue then come up increasingly in the late 18th century, throughout the 19th century, as countries throughout Poland, the Hungarians in Austria-Hungary, the Poles attempting to secede from Russia and the Austrian Empire. We see it anywhere that countries are asserting their right to break free from some larger domineering state where they feel that they are not being appropriately represented. And we note also that we find many examples of secession throughout history that are justified on the grounds of self-determination. We should note that the number of countries in the world has nearly tripled since 1945. There are only about 80 countries at the end of the Second World War. Well, where did all those other countries come from? They came into existence through secession movements, all justified on self-determination. And then, of course, after the end of the Soviet Union, we had another 16 countries that came into existence, all based on and justified by self-determination. They went to votes, they voted to secede, or sometimes they didn't even have a national referendum, as in the case of the Baltics, and they broke off. And they didn't think, oh, gee, do we have a consensus with the Politburo here? Are they going to be upset if we move away? Are we breaking our mystical bond with the Russians by breaking off and forming an independent Estonia? No. The reality is that minorities within a larger union have a right to break off. It's basic self-determination. And then the other main issue here is the issue of what happens when countries get smaller and break off. And as we'll find in a lot of the data here in the books, the empirical evidence shows that as states get smaller, as they break off from other states, as small states compete, and as they face the threat of further secession and being broken up into smaller pieces, they're actually more open to trade, to the migration of workers, to economic development. As we see going back in work done by non-libertarian historians, going back at least 500 years. So this is a basic concept here where we're opposed to state building and centralization of power because it leads to a flowering of freedom. And fundamentally, it's the right thing to do because the right of self-determination is essential. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Jonathan Casey speaks against a national divorce. He thinks that this might ultimately lead to less freedom.
And so when you're talking about a national divorce, you're also talking about putting massive barriers and borders in between people. Ryan talked about how smaller states tend to have a more open border system. But the problem is, Ryan, in the United States, between states, we have a perfect open border system. We have no trade tariffs. We have no customs. We don't have to get a visa from going one state to another. These borders that would be imposed by a national divorce would be a net negative to individual liberty. So right off the bat, we're behind the 8 ball on national divorce as far as achieving more individual liberty. The differences, I can't read my notes here, sorry, jotted them down. The differences between, one of the problems with national divorce is that it often conflates the idea of geographic decentralization with political decentralization. None of us here would say, well, North Korea is more decentralized than the United States. Of course not. It's much smaller than the United States. So inherently, smaller nations are not necessarily more free just because somebody might be able to leave them. One of the problems that I hear a lot with national divorce advocates is they often say, well, if you don't like where you're living now, you can simply move to another state. And I'm sorry, freedom is not being forced to leave your family, forced to leave your job, forced to leave your home. Freedom is being able to live where you want to live, wherever that may be, as long as you aren't harming anybody else, as long as you aren't imposing on anyone else. And I lost track of the time, so I think I've got a few minutes here.
You got 2.5.
2.5, thank you. Where would these borders be? A lot of national divorce advocates ask, was our state that cultural divides in this nation are beyond repair, or we need to divide down smaller. It'll solve our problems. People will be able to choose their preferred form of government. The reality is, where are you going to divide these lines up? Because the real cultural divide in America is not between right and left, or excuse me, not between red states and blue states. The real cultural divide in this country is between rural areas and urban areas. And so wherever you're going to divide the lines up, no state doesn't have rural areas or urban, and they both have urban and rural areas. So where are you going to divide this country up along the lines that is actually going to improve individual liberty and improve the cooperation and social cohesion of the United States? Because that's the ultimate. A lot of national divorce advocates say that the social discord in the United States will be solved by breaking us up. But again, where are you going to draw the line? Even if you draw the line at the state border, you're going to end up with states with a large percentage of Republicans being dominated by Democrats, or vice versa in red states. So ultimately, I think we have to get down to the answer, and I'm hoping Ryan spends a little bit more time on how and why national divorce in the United States will lead to more individual liberty. Thank you.
Thank you.
McMaken is basically talking about installing a mechanism or right for secession. If one part of the country turns out to be in a permanent minority situation, they will always lose elections and will get politically ignored, given that governments favor the majority voting bloc. In the discussion part, McMaken and Casey discuss the practical side.
I don't think there's something magical about the state level of government. That, oh, you have a right to self-determination as long as you're one of the original American states, or you have statehood or something like that. Certainly, if we look at, we got Locke, we got Molinari, we got Charles Dunoyer, all of these serious liberals would say, no, of course there isn't some magical level of government. Any group of people that can put together, Locke's position was any group of people that can put together some sort of legislative body gets to have self-determination. And this is in direct contradiction to John C. Calhoun, who did believe there was something magical about the state level. Obviously, he wasn't in favor of groups smaller than the state declaring their own independence, because that would have been problematic for the secession issue, or for just anti-slavery people in general. He didn't think they should get their own governments. And so we're talking about a very specific issue where I'm not telling other people how to do things. And just in general, I don't have some national plan for, oh, these people should declare independence and those people should do this. In fact, the essence of my position is the opposite of the anti-national divorce position, in that I'm not telling other people what they should want or how they should govern themselves or what they should do. Because fundamentally saying, oh, you don't get to declare independence because you might govern in a way I don't agree with. This is, of course, a colonialist view. This is the idea that, and has always been used by central governments to say, well, we can't let those Algerians break off and self-govern because they're barbarians. We can't let those Apaches govern themselves because, well, we just all know they're incapable of civilization. And we hear a lot of the same stuff here now is, oh, well, the only reason those people want to secede is so they can reinstate slavery, which is basically a laughable position, although I've seen many on the left make this claim. And so I'm not saying, oh, this state, that state, this region, that region. I don't have a map in my head of what's supposed to happen. I'm simply saying that if there are groups of people that, like Mises says, if a group of people get together and they have a plebiscite that says, hey, we wish to secede and form our own government, that group should be taken seriously, and that you should enter into negotiations for how to accomplish that end. So yeah, I don't have a specific plan.
Do you have a response to that?
I think you have to have a plan. If you're putting forward a proposition saying we should break up the country, wishful thinking and hoping things work out isn't going to work out. One of the ironies of liberty is that liberty requires a government to protect it. I'm not an anarchist, never will say I am, but I think you have to make sure that you have plans in place for that when you move forward towards a system. If you want actual true political decentralization, that has to be planned out. You simply can't remove restrictions on local governments. Ryan, you stated that we can't tell people how to govern. Absolutely we can tell states not how to govern. I'm sorry, but yes, we should tell states, no, you can't discriminate against blacks. No, you can't ban gay marriage. Yes, absolutely, because we believe in liberty. We believe that, no, government doesn't have any rights. We have all the rights. And so we absolutely have the right to tell government, no, you can't do that.
Empirical literature over the last 30 years, especially in Europe, seems to suggest that smaller countries compete with each other for lowering taxes and free trade. The reason is that this secures their wealth in re-election.
Well, I often hear the argument that, well, we'll end up with 1,000, or, the hope that we'll end up with 1,000 Liechtensteins. And that always, to me, that always sounds like Oprah. You get a Liechtenstein, you get a Liechtenstein, everybody gets a Liechtenstein. And I'm sorry, that's not how it's going to work out. It hasn't worked out. Even with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we didn't see further and further decentralization. We haven't seen that at all. In fact, we've seen the exact opposite, where countries are joining NATO, they're joining the European Union. So instead of this further and further decentralization that national divorce advocates often claim would happen, the exact opposite is what happens in the real world. So as far as political discord goes, sure, in some theoretical sense, allowing people to move to the little local tyranny that they want to, fine, I don't care. I'm not in charge of those local tyrannies. What I can do is I can influence what my country is doing and what other governments, what other state governments, what other local governments can or can't do. And I think that is the fundamental principle of liberalism, is to prevent the state from, any state, within as peacefully as we can, prevent them from infringing on rights.
Response there?
Well, I can't believe my opponent is implying that the breakup of the Soviet Union was a bad thing because it allows governments to go off and found their own local tyranny. This was an obviously good thing, this breakup of a large state into a bunch of small states. I don't see the downside in any way of this happening. And the one irony, of course, is that a lot of people who are very much vehemently in favor of Ukraine asserting its independence from Moscow are also anti-secession. Well, the only reason Ukraine exists is because of a plebiscite where it voted to declare secession from the Soviet Union in 1993. And so obviously a good thing. And gee, did all these countries that broke off from the Soviet Union found a bunch of tyrannical local governments that were somehow worse than the Soviet Union? Obviously not. In fact, the Baltic states of Europe are among some of the wealthiest and have seen huge increases in growth in terms of GDP per capita and wealth in those countries. And some joined NATO, some didn't. So, I mean, these countries decided to do different things in different ways. It's called having independence, and it's called self-determination. And this assertion that, yes, of course, we need to have some people telling other people in other countries how to live because they shouldn't discriminate against each other. Well, how come that we're assuming that the United States then is the correct level of government? How can I can certainly make the case then that, gee, the United States is too independent as is. We should give the United Nations more power to assert that the United States violates human rights on its own. And we should give international organizations more power. The International Criminal Court should be trying Americans and putting them on trial for discrimination and racism. And you can go up the ladder just as much as you can go down the ladder in terms of telling people how to live. And this is why the liberals consistently, from Jefferson on, have said we need more local self-determination, especially in the United States, where each state is a republic with a legislature, with a Supreme Court. We're acting like this is some sort of tribal government where there's no rule of law. But that's, of course, not the reality at all. So one minute we're told that democracy and republics work very, very well. But the next minute, as soon as one of those republics wants to be a republic that's not directly under the U.S. federal government, well, then suddenly republics don't work anymore. And we need some Supreme Court people in Washington to tell them how to do everything.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy videos like this, please subscribe and hit the notification bell.